Let me first say that if you came to this session because you saw that there was going to be a different moderator, not myself, I apologise that it's me. The moderator who was supposed to do this session, Merv, was unable to be here today, and I've stepped in at very short notice, which is also my little loophole here to let you know that I have been talking with these writers, but I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to read their books, given that I was given this gig at 9 o'clock this morning. But I'm really pleased and charmed to be here talking about this wonderful subject of biography. As an historian myself, writing people's lives is obviously germane to what I do, and I think it is what all historians do, whether they write biography as a genre or not. But we're going to talk around the edges of all of that today. What is biography? What constitutes a biography? How do you write it? What is the art of the biographer? How do you choose your subjects? So I'm going to start with you, Ben. You write books about spies, intelligence, the Cold War, World War II, events that are within living history, clearly. I'm wondering how you see your role, particularly as a popular writer, a writer of narrative non-fiction, sitting in with the biographer's role, the biographer's work in the world.
Most of my books, you're right, are about spies, criminals, people operating deception operations in the Second World War. Really nice people on the whole. On the whole, fairly untrustworthy people, which makes the task of trying to work out the truth about their lives quite complicated. So most of my source material comes either from declassified archives around the world, mostly in Britain and America, and those are also, in their own way, rather unreliable forms of source material, because secret material, intelligence material that is declassified, is different in a way from any other kind of documentary bureaucratic evidence in the sense that it's true. Because spies never expect this stuff to be released, and so therefore the people who are running spies and who are themselves spies put stuff in the archive that really is reliable, oddly enough. On the other hand, the other half of what I research tends to come from oral history. So it comes from living witnesses, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, witnesses to their own lives, who often tend to be extremely unreliable narrators of their own life. So part of what I have to do is to fill it out from this often vast amount of material, the evidence that I find most credible and often interesting. And it is different from a sort of, as it were, a traditional biographer's work, which is to sort of take everything and then sort of find a sort of historical path through it. Mine is a narrative non-fiction impetus. So for me, the narrative is, the truth is king, so it has to be true, it has to be reliable, it has to be verifiable, but it also has to be narrative driven. So for me, the story, in a way, is as important as the life. And I'll just give you sort of one example of how complicated this can be sometimes, and rewarding too. One of my earliest books was, I see you've got it there, called Agent Zigzag, which was about a criminal, a Second World War crook. He'd been a con man and a safe cracker before the war. And then he was recruited by German intelligence at the beginning of the war and was trained in a special German sort of spy camp. He was in prison at the time, and he'd done a deal with them. And he was parachuted into Britain in 1941 and immediately defected to the other side. So he became a double agent for the British against the Germans. And then it seems quite likely that he defected back again to the Germans once he'd been sent back to occupied Europe. So that's why they called him Zigzag. They couldn't really work out whose side he was on. And he wrote his own biography after the war, which is a wonderful document because most of it is a tissue of lies. He made up at least half of what he claimed had happened to him. So the pleasure then of being able to get hold of the declassified archives and being able to contradict his own version of his life was a great pleasure. He ended up as the crime correspondent of the Daily Telegraph.
Sushma, it strikes me that what you've done in your book, which is at a totally different time period, clearly from Ben's in living memory and can talk to, using oral sources, can talk and test the evidence. What you've done in your work, and you can tell us more about it, it seems to me is a version of that revisionist history, but you've looked at all the many strands and the ways in which your subject's life has been created over hundreds and hundreds of years. Clearly your archives are very different, but how do you chart that line between what is empirically verifiable, the truth, and what is mythology and what is hagiography?
That's a really great question, thank you. When you said the words vast amount of evidence, I could have cried, because as an ancient historian, evidence is limited. And I think when you're looking at a figure like Chandragupta, so he is a ruler maybe 2,500 years ago, I think unless we had some kind of seance, I would have no idea what he had to say. We have nothing directly from him, nothing at all. And so when you're looking at writing a biography of a really ancient figure, even if it's a ruler of a major dynasty like the Mauryans, you're very limited in what you can say about that person, because it's what you'll tend to find are the standard biographies kind of rewritten almost every generation or every so often, and often they tell you more about the time that they were written in rather than the person himself, because normally it is a him. Whereas for Chandragupta, I want to do something different. If it's a biography, it'd be very, very short. It'd be a short booklet, and we still wouldn't know much about him. We've no idea what he looks like, don't know what he said, don't even know exactly where he visited. We don't know where he had his major battles. You know, there's one that says he's along the Indus. Indus River's quite long. And even where he lived. Pataliputra is now under the modern city of Patna, so we can't access that either. So there is so much you don't know. And so in the end, you can either veer off into historical fiction, which is super, and it can be really interesting, a wonderful exercise for ancient history anyway, or you build up that story around the figure and you have him as a really useful thread running through. So you look at the other sources, you look at the different ways he was invented, interpreted, reinterpreted over the generations and through massive historical moments, whether it's the independence movement, whether it's the moment after independence. And you just look at, you know, how was he expressed artistically? What role did he play? How was he reshaped? How was he used? And how did his story change in light of all of that? And none of that helps you get back to the person himself, because we never will. And so with a biography, you either group some of these ancient figures together in some way, or you write a history that's mostly around that kind of figure. And I found it really interesting just looking at this figure through all these other lenses. And it tells us so much about ourselves. But I think what I found particularly interesting about Chandragupta is we have virtually nothing from any South Asian sources. The material we have, it's from a completely different culture. It was mostly from the Macedonians, so the evidence we have is mostly from the Greeks and the Romans, not even the subcontinent. So you're looking at this figure from such a distance and through so many different layers, so it's a completely different thing from your vast amount of evidence.
So it's almost like a biography of biographies. Something closer to historiography, in a way, than what we might traditionally think of as a cradle-to-grave biography of a person. Yeah, Katherine, that leads me to a question that I'd like you to kick off, but I think others could probably answer it as well. What leads you to your subject in the first place? Is it that old adage that the subject chooses you?
I think for me, John Donne was a great, great Renaissance love poet, writing at the same time as Shakespeare. I was given him by my parents. When I was about 9 years old, they used to put poetry by the sink where we brushed our teeth and pay us 50 pence per poem for every poem we memorized. And I was a profoundly nasty mercenary child with a very expensive taste in small plastic dog figurines. And for that reason, I memorized dozens of John Donne poems. And those of you who know John Donne, just to be very clear, not the licentious verse, not the things which are essentially just 1,000 metaphors for a penis. The satiric verse, the actual love poetry, the songs. And then years later, when I had done my PhD, which was on John Donne, and came to write the book, I realized I wanted to write about this man. because he was someone who was able to hold both real horror. He lived at a time when he was Catholic. To Catholic was to be persecuted. He probably saw his great-uncle hung, drawn, and quartered. He certainly saw his brother thrown in jail for harbouring a priest, and he then died horribly and alone in jail of the bubonic plague. He was himself suicidal. He had this sense of the deep sorrow of life. And he is also, of all Renaissance voices, the one most insistent on joy and awe and astonishment. And he stands up in the pulpit at a time when there was a debate about whether or not laughter was a sin. And he says, not to laugh, that is a contempt. That is the great stupidity. And so when I wanted to try and capture something of that man, I suddenly realized that it was like I'd been carrying around this suitcase my entire life of poetry. And I opened it, and it was still there, and I can still recite the poems, and I do so only when drunk at parties, and people try to stop me. But I was so grateful to them for saying when I was young, people have memorized poems for 3,000 years. Why should you not do also?
So I'm fascinated by that, because what it sounds like to me is that although you now in your book have shaped this man's life, this man shaped your life.
He did. I think it gets under your skin. You know, often the things that you are taught to love young, they come back for you later.
There you go, parents out there. Peter, I'm going to move to you now, and we're going to be in conversation with each other later in the festival at more detail about your book on the Endeavour. And so it's been wonderful dipping into that book, reading that book, and it strikes me in the context of the conversation that we're having now that what you've done is write a biography not of a person, but of an object. You've written a biography of a boat. Tell us about how you write the story, a cradle-to-grave biography of a thing.
Well, in that case, it should be an acorn-to-seabed biography of the ship, because what I've done is hopefully try and take a lot of the biographical form and apply it in a new way. But just something on what everyone else has been saying first, which just struck me as a reflection, really, is that, in a way, what we're talking about here is our love of history, of historical periods. And these biographical subjects that we're picking out almost become the key to understanding the period. How did they respond at a particular moment? So in your case, it's the world of the 20th century and espionage and war and conflict. And in yours, I don't know, we have ancient history. And again, the poetry of Shakespeare's age. And our characters help us to tell us something about that. But yeah, I think in this particular case, to get back to your question,
you can share if you want, it's fine.
I can. But I've always enjoyed reading biography. There's something particularly applicable about biography in the 18th century, because after all, this is the age when biography really came into its modern form. It emerged out of the hagiographies of the Middle Ages and so on. And you get Boswell's great Life of Johnson, which really set the tone, I suppose, for lots of biographies that came afterwards. So telling the story of a life does fit with, I suppose, with the ideals of the age or the spirit of the age, whatever you want to say. But also, I should say, later on, in the Victorian age, there was this thing known as the thing biography, if I'm not going to repeat myself. And this was that you take an inanimate object, it might be a penny or a walking stick or a ship, for example, and you follow its course through life. And this was something that I'd had as my own separate idea when I was a young boy, because I imagined this idea of following a 5-pence piece around the village that I lived in when I was a primary school student, and thinking if you passed it to the lady who sells you sweets in the shop, then it can tell her story, and she might pass it to somebody else. And it becomes a useful narrative thread in itself. It's something different. It's a bit interesting. But in terms of the ship, I'm not going to talk about this too much because it's not quite what our business is today, but I thought it just had a really interesting life. It changed. It had these very distinct moments and phases that it went through. So yeah, biography worked, I think, and that's how maybe in the 21st century we're taking an old form and adapting it in a new way. And I think you described Ben, your new book is a biography of sorts, but a biography of a building, maybe.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it's fascinating. And Peter's a very brilliant sort of exemplar of this, the way that biography has developed. I mean, the age of the chest-crushing, cradle-to-grave, every moment, you know, there's often, we were discussing this earlier, there's often in the sort of traditional biography, there's a whole chapter that's called background, which sort of makes you want to open a vein as soon as you open the book. So I think we sort of very much of modern historical writing is character. It's interrogating the past through the people of the past. So multiple biographies of a single subject are wonderful ways to explore both the similarities between the way we think today and the stark differences of our historical subject. So the last book I did was a biography of a prison, of Colditz, which is the famous POW camp in the Second World War. Now, what I found fascinating about that subject was, again, from boyhood, I had inherited a view of Colditz. I played the board game. It was a huge deal when I was growing up, that the story of Colditz, the largest and really the most infamous of the prisoner of war camps during the Second World War. But the story I'd inherited was that there was really only one character in Colditz, and it was the same character, and he was an upper middle class English gent with a moustache who spent most of the war trying to tunnel out of this Gothic castle. Actually, on research, I found that Colditz contained multiple characters, many of whom had never been written about before because they didn't really fit in to the accepted template of what that story was supposed to be about. So it contains all sorts of people who really had never been given any light before. And instead of it being a sort of very straightforward story of British daring-do, it turned out to be a story about sexuality and class and race and mental health and all the things that we are fascinated by today, but that were still rather taboo in the post-war period. And I'll just give you one example. There was one Indian prisoner in Colditz. His name was Birendranath Mazumdar. He was a doctor with the British Army. He was captured at Dunkirk, and he was imprisoned in Colditz. And I don't want to give the story away because it's a wonderful story, but he escaped from Colditz. But his story has never been told because he didn't fit with the accepted story. So if we take multiple biography and apply it to different subject matter, I think it's a wonderful way to crack open hidden histories or sort of partially hidden histories.
So let's talk about the revisionist aspect of that there. What happens, Sushma, when you are writing a biography or studying the biography of a person who is a revered figure, a hero? What happens if you find that you've got something to say about that person that might not be popular, that might go against the grain of the accepted wisdom of who that person was and what they did?
That's a really good question, because I totally had to deal with this because, as you say, Chandragupta, he is revered. I mean, this is the founder of the Mauryan dynasty, widely regarded as one of the, if not the greatest of the most ancient Indian dynasties. And so what you do is you bury the information and hope no one sees it, but it is there. To give just one example, I mean, there's this story, if you probably don't know, it's a bit obscure. He had this battle, apparently, with one of Alexander the Great's generals in the aftermath. So Seleucus came over to the Indus, and apparently they had some kind of skirmish. And then they had a peace treaty. I mean, of the three parts that came down to us, also from the Greek sources, there was apparently some kind of marriage alliance. Now, as you can imagine, I mean, this marriage alliance apparently was between Seleucus's daughter and Chandragupta. That's a bit of a shock. But what that tells you, I mean, we have no idea if this happened, absolutely none. You can just guess, you can throw a coin, who knows. But actually, the way that's been written about by, especially around the colonial period, so when you've got, John Mill, so pre-colonial period onwards, it's very much written about very differently by British and Indian scholars, as you can imagine, and that has changed dramatically. But even now, in some of the TV series, in some of the historical novels written about him, all of a sudden the Greek or the Macedonian Persian wife is very much cast as this horrible person who's conniving and evil, and he's got to divorce her and get rid of her and marry the Indian virtuous wife instead. But once again, that tells you very much about right now, but it's not very comfortable at all. And in another generation or two, I'm sure it'll be reinterpreted yet again. But just to really emphasise, the sources for this are so limited, we haven't a clue. So you can write this or not about particular very ancient figures who are so important in the subcontinent. But on the other hand, it tells you nothing about the person because you just don't know.
So that's an interesting question too of what gets left out, and what you've just also kind of alluded to is that women often get left out, particularly of the biographies of great men, if we're talking about heroes. And that's why we have a plethora of books on Shakespeare's wife, and there's a new one that's just come out in Australia about the first wife of George Orwell that's doing very well at the moment. I'm wondering, Katherine, in your biography of Donne, were there characters that had not been previously included in Donne biographies that you, as a young woman today, with a different idea of inclusivity, might have wanted to capture?
So the most obvious there would be Anne Donne. Most people who know a little bit about John Donne just know the expression John Donne, Anne Donne, undone, because when he married her, he did so without her father's consent, and she was 17, and he was thrown in jail, a very specific jail, which was the nastiest in London, which was said to be carpeted with lice. And Anne, for fairly good reason, doesn't often get mentioned that much in biographies. She rarely, in fact never, has a chapter to herself. We don't know much about her. We don't even really know how she spelt her name. There are references to her in other people's letters, but if she wrote letters, they are lost. And the thing I wanted to do was try to conjure with the book. She has a chapter which is just called Anne, what it might have been to be like, to be her. Because if you believe, like I do, that John Donne was probably the greatest writer of desire in the English language, then what would it be like to marry that man becomes a vivid question. And the answer, if you can spend a lot of time in the archives trying to unpick what there is probably not great. She married at 17 and she died when she was younger than me. She was about 34. And she was pregnant or recovering from pregnancy or both her entire adult life. She bore 12 children, 2 of whom were stillborn, some of whom died before she died. And I wanted to think about this other side of Donne's life, what it would be to be with her, what he writes about her, and what it would have been like for her, this valiant girl who took this risk in marrying him. Women of the upper classes who took that kind of risk to defy their parents. One of them was beaten about the head until her skull cracked. Another one, her mother wrote a letter to her to say, it would be better that you had not been born and that I had not been born and that my mother had not been born so that you had not brought this shame on our family. And so she took this great risk. And then one of the things I wanted to ask with the book was it worth the risk? And I think when you know as much as we can find, the answer hangs in the balance.
So, Peter, you teach biography as part of what you do at Oxford. So you obviously have thought about a lot of these issues in great deal in terms of ethics, methodology, in terms of the intellectual exercise in itself. Picking up there from what Katherine has said, how do you speak to your students about whether a biographical subject can live exclusively in and of their time, as opposed to casting our own morals, our own values, and in a sense drawing an equivalence between contemporary lives and past lives?
Well, there's a question. Thank you. Two quotes that I try and remember for my students about biography, which are useful here. This first one was from a man called Dr. Arbuthnot, and he lived just at the same time as Johnson. So he was responding to Boswell's Life of Johnson, the book that I mentioned earlier. And he said, biography has brought a new terror to death. That was one of the things. And the second one, 100 years later, by Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde said that this is a very of its time quote, so forgive me, but he said, every great man has his disciples, but it's always Judas that writes the biography, which is an interesting one to remember. Yeah, I think you have to, I think, and this is how I think of writing about history anyway, you have to put aside, in the first place, your 21st century perspective, and you have to go and meet the characters on their own terms in their own age. And only after you've been through that process can you start a process of reckoning. And I think this is a little bit like the process of getting to know anyone, any of our friends. You can't jump to a judgment right at the beginning. So if you're trying to contort your subject into some theory you have about modern politics or the world as it should be today, I think you're starting off very much on the wrong foot, and you're bound to produce a very second-rate work. Whereas if you immerse yourself in the period to begin with, try and see what they were doing, you get to this point where, and this is, I think, what you said to Catherine, where you are changed by your subject in some sense. You start learning lessons from them. That requires a great deal of humility on your part, a good deal of empathy. These are characteristics that I think have to be present with any biographer. And then later on, I suppose, you come to your own judgment at moments of crisis. Did they act well? Did they act badly? But for me, that has to really come much later on. And, you know, this other thought of being changed by your subject is one that I think this is worth mentioning, that in the world of politics today, or even in celebrity culture, this idea of attaching your life to somebody else's can be seen as quite a positive thing sometimes. This is why we always get conservative politicians writing biographies of Edmund Burke, because they want their identity to be in some strange way bound up with that of their subjects. And I think in a weird way you are changed afterwards. You internalise these poems or these figures from the deep past. They're how people come to know you in a way, which is an interesting thought in itself. So humility would be my watchword.
Humility. Great word. And I'm going to go to you, Ben, and ask, what do you think is one of the most important tools that a biographer needs to have in their toolbox? Humility, what about for you?
I think Peter makes a very good point. I think if we simply see the past through, well, first of all, it's impossible not to carry with us our 21st century preconceptions and perhaps our prejudices and the moral judgments that come with those. But so long as we're aware of them and we are not being dishonest in our presentation of them, because the alternative isn't really history at all. If we see the past through a strictly sort of a prism of moral judgment, what we end up doing is producing a sort of moral accountancy. We're saying so-and-so good, behaved well by our modern light, so-and-so bad, we can't be having that. And the whole debate, it seems, at the moment about the past, particularly in Britain, has become one of sort of atonement rather than sort of examination. There's a sort of automatic tendency to sort of feel that we need to apologise. And in some cases it is egregious, the past, but it must be judged, as Peter says, in the context of the past. So I think absolutely humility is right up there. I suppose the other one is, in a way, contiguity of our lives. I mean, the people of the past are not so different from us. They have a similar sense of humour. They have a similar set of urges. They have a similar set of sort of happinesses and sadnesses. And there's a tendency also to see the past as if it's a completely foreign country. It actually isn't. I mean, we are similar human beings. So I suppose along with humility, I would say the other great tool is to see the past as a reflection in a way of ourselves. And without necessarily imposing a set of judgments on it. Does that make sense? So I guess that's the other tool that I would try and use.
I disagree with you entirely, but we can talk about that in the green room afterwards. I mean, that's the thing that historians do. I remember being told by one of my professors very early on that to remember that the past is not us in funny clothes. And that always stuck with me because, as we've been discussing, you also have to understand people within their context, and contexts change. But these are some of the things that obviously one has to decide on when they are choosing their subject. And Sushma, I'm interested to know, we've heard about Catherine's choice of subject. Why did you end up becoming obsessed, as you clearly have been, with this? That's a good word. Obsessed is a good word. I'm not pathologizing you here. How did you come to your subject? And I want to know whether in any way you fell in love with your subject while doing this.
Do I have a secret tattoo of Chandragupta? No, I don't. I'm not very obsessed. It's a weird one. I've always been really interested in what happens when two peoples who have never met meet for the first time ever. And when Seleucus and Chandragupta, or rather the Greeks and the Indians, met, in the 4th century, that was the first time. That's a really big deal. And so when you've got those earliest writings about the other people, and they are very much other people, it's a genuine mystery. These, extraordinary culture. It's very different gods, different lands, different speaking, different religious traditions. And everyone writes about Alexander, of course they do. But I was more interested in this moment of Chandragupta and Seleucus, actually, because their family connection appeared to have lasted for a good 3 generations. That's a long time. And obviously we only have tantalising fragments, so, too much evidence is lacking. But there was something in that. And for me, you asked them, which word would you describe? I think for me, it has to be experimentation, because you can't, as I said, you cannot write a biography of Chandragupta that's more than like a paragraph long. So how do you approach this moment of meeting in the present day? And so, yes, you look at this ancient stuff, but in the book, I was really interested in how that ancient relationship was reinterpreted when you've got that very different kind of relationship between the British and the Indians that's evolving. And what does that tell us about that over a good, century and a half? And it tells us so much. So it's just a very different way of exploring. But I think you have to experiment with different approaches to the past. And, there is a whole chunk on object biography. I'm a curator, and the curator is my day job. So, object biography, that's my thing. And that I am obsessed about. And you can write about how certain objects, like the first sculpture ever installed in the Indian Parliament complex, is of Chandragupta. I mean, he clearly meant a lot to India and Indians and this notion of nation. And so, it's sort of piecing together these different ideas of this person rather than the actual person.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, so gather them together and then I'm going to come to you. Katherine, one last one for you there. So on the theme of experimentation, memoir has become a very popular genre and in some ways has replaced biography, which is almost a little bit 20th century. And there are a number of cross-genres now where people have written, biographers have written their own research journey or written about their relationship with their subject in a memoir-type way into their work. Were you tempted to experiment with the form in that way, given that you clearly have such a personal backstory?
Not at all, no. I think what I wanted... There is no I in the book at all. I never used that word. I think what I wanted rather was... There are already books about John Donne. So I thought I could either write about my John Donne, but rather than that, what if I tried to write a book about John Donne that you would actually read? Because there is one great biography of John Donne, but there is also this famous, wonderful, incredibly thorough book by A.C. Ball just called Donne, A Life. Every single Donne biographer is deeply indebted to this man, a true scholar. But that book would be easier to eat than to read. It is hard work. And so, for me, I think the main task of writing this book, which is Super Infinite is quite short, it's about 70,000 words, but it started off at about 180. And it was just choosing what to leave out. And I think there's a difference between doing history and writing history, doing biography and writing biography, but the actual writing, deciding... You all know this feeling so well. You spent 2 weeks finding a specific fact, so God help you, everyone else is going to know it too. But deciding to cut that and instead to try to give someone something that would grab you by the wrist and pull you through history, that I think was the reason the book took 10 years. I cut half of it.
That's extraordinary. I love that expression, grab you by the wrist and pull you through history. Do we have some questions coming up on the floor here? Do you want to stand up, sir, in the front? Yeah. Is there a microphone coming down to you? Great. We've got a number of questions. So can I just remind people that the best questions are actually questions? Sorry, we're just having a little technical issue here. Catherine, while we wait for the microphone, do you want to just answer that last question about what is the most important tool in the biographer's toolbox?
Oh, I think the thing I would tell my students would be nuance.
Nuance.
I think that we are somewhere between the two extremes. I tell my students this always. There is a space between the past is another country, they do things differently there, and the past is just like us, and we can trace an absolute continuum. And I think if you can teach them to bring the full, cavalry of their nuance, their wit, their understanding, their focus, then I think they will arrive with something which might be close to truth.
Lovely. So we've got humility, empathy, experimentation, and nuance. I think that's the title of our collective biography. Are we going here? Yeah, great.
Yeah. So when Mr. Macintyre was talking about how we look at the past and we look at them as people and not through judgments, you said you had a disagreement and about how context changes. I was wondering if the green room brawl, as it were, could happen here and what the disagreement was that you had and what Mr. Macintyre's take on it would be.
Oh, and that's the green room brawl is to come. We haven't had that yet,
Let's
so
do it now.
we could sell tickets to that if we wanted to, Ben.
I'd rather do it now. I mean, it's some. I think in a way I'm echoing what Catherine says, which is that it's more that if you treat the past as a completely alien world, it's therefore much more tempting to superimpose our own views on it. Whereas if you realise there is a continuity, there is an empathy, you can feel your way into the way the past is. It's not that they're wearing funny clothes, it's that they actually, in many ways, and in many ways they don't, but in many ways they do think and feel in similar ways to the way we do now. If you treat them completely as aliens from another country, you distance yourself from them, and that's as bad in a way as getting too close. I'm sorry, that's not the brawl you wanted.
And what was your point? I want to know what your disagreement was.
So my point is, and I'll base it on a recent biography that I have read, where the author, she's writing a biography of somebody who lived in the middle of the last century, and the author is, and she's writing about how this woman was very suppressed and dominated by her husband, and then left out of history altogether. She compares that to her own life as a woman living in Australia, middle class, quite educated woman, and talks about her subject and her own life as if they could stand at the back fence and have a conversation with each other and they'd know exactly what each other are talking about. So she's drawing an equivalence between her own sense of oppression and what that woman's sense of oppression would be. And maybe it's just the way that she did it and possibly with not enough nuance, but I found that to be intellectually dishonest.
Thank you.
Gentleman standing up there, thank you.
Okay, just a dollop of pop culture here. This is to Sushma. Have you played or have you seen anyone play Civilization 6? Because Chandragupta Maurya is one of the leading characters there, which represents India. And he's portrayed as this really macho-looking, cool young dude. So I just, how does these things, because you mentioned the other looking at someone, right? So Civilization 6 is like for the younger generation and some oldies like me still playing it. So how does this other, in the version of pop culture, look at these historic heroes? Not from an Indian point of view or from their nation's point of view, but from an outside point of view. How does pop culture transform these characters?
Great question. Pop culture.
Thank you. I actually included almost an entire chapter on pop culture because he, as you say, he's in a whole load of different board games. And it's really interesting at the moment. There seems to be a trend on social media as well of depicting, the ancient kings and deities as really muscled up figures with the weapons and everything bulging. It's very different from the kind of figures I grew up with in the past. Yeah, So in terms of the game, I'm afraid I have not played Civilizations. I'm aware of it, but I'm not a big gaming kind of person, I'm afraid. But the way Chandragupta is shaped in popular culture, I mean, if you look at the historical novels, if you look at comic books, he's even in a whole bunch of comic books. The comic book, it's just pure invention. And actually, that's not based on anything in his life at all, because I read it very carefully. It's actually based on, I think, a 19th century South Indian novel. So, you might be selling this idea as, there'll be some kind of truth in this popular culture thing, but there's just none. And it's interesting in the historical novels, as I say, it tells you so much about the author and the time that we're living in and what's likely to sell and what the public is likely to be absolutely fine with, than it does about Chandragupta. It's just invention. But I'm a big fan of popular culture. I love graphic novels, so I'm very happy to read them, but I wouldn't read them for actual history or actual biography. It's just entertainment.
So,
yeah, hi.
Nick, yeah.
I was asking a question. So
my
question is for...
Would you mind standing up?
Yes,
Thank you.
hi. So my question is for Peter. So if I wanted to write, if someone wanted to write their own story, can you suggest a framework for a novice person, how they could go about writing their own story so that it's interesting and they could publish it? I mean, can you give a framework? And
Did you get that?
Sorry, can you put the microphone a little bit more in front of your mouth because it was hard to hear that? Thanks.
Okay, so...
That much better.
Yeah, so if someone wanted to write their own story, if you wanted to write their own story, what is a framework, an easy framework that one could use to write a story about yourself?
Wow, I'm getting the easy questions today. Well, I think if you want to write some personal narrative, you want to do some life writing, there's lots I could tell you. But I think what I'd get you to think about in the first place is why would people... Well, you could write for two different reasons. You could write for yourself. If you're writing for a wide audience, you've got to think of why this book is or this piece of writing is going to appeal. So what is the story which is embedded within yours that kind of transcends just a normal life? What's unusual about it? But yeah, I think at the moment we are living through an age, and I think you picked up on this really well. So biographies come into the 21st century, and it's kind of morphed in all sorts of different directions. You get little biographies of bits of lives of various people, but then you also get memoir. So if you look back to the turn of the century, you have things like Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, which started off something which was called the misery memoir, and we had a lot of inflation and misery over the years where they got more and more miserable. But then you get this idea, which I think you were kind of alluding to with John Donne, which is putting yourself into a biography of somebody else. So there's loads of experiments in form which are going on with that at the moment, and you can look at, well, I don't know, a book like Stasiland, which would be one I could recommend for you to go and take away, where you see, and so goes the buzzer. I started, so I'll finish. Yeah, so when you see your life being transposed onto a bigger history, and you're using yourself as an active participant there. Okay, thank you.
Well, I think you'll agree with me that these are four extraordinary thinkers who have thought deeply about their subject. I encourage you to buy their books. You've got 14 to choose from. In Ben, he's got half a bookstore over there. Please go, and they'll be signing their books. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.